Hi, this is Father Mark Boulos with the Bible as Literature podcast. When a student plays the teacher with an earthen vessel, there comes a moment in their imaginary dialogue when the trust they thought they had is broken. It's not broken, of course, because the dialogue itself was platonic. It's akin to the crisis of faith a student has when they hear the Bible clearly for the first time and realize the Jesus they heard about in Sunday school is not the Jesus of the Gospels. This crisis of trust is a sudden realization that the point of reference for the imaginary dialogue in your head is not the point of reference for the liberating monologue that breaks through to you from the lips of the earthen vessel. Your platonic dialogue exemplifies the blind leading the blind, leading you into a snare inside your mind. To break free from this crisis of faith, you must move past your confession that you don't trust the earthen vessel. You must realize the truth, namely, that it is the Torah you do not trust. You trust in yourself and your construct of the blind leading the blind. You value the comfort of blindness more than the teaching of God. So, Habibi, you have to make a choice. The comfort of the snare and the pit, the blue pill, or the difficulty of the painful thing you don't trust, the red pill, which comes to you through the earthen vessel, the bitter delivery mechanism of God's monologue. The problem, of course, is that the red pill shares nothing in common with everything about you. You can't find one book in your library, one stance in any corner of your broken premises that shares anything in fellowship with the red pill. Every time it is offered, it seems wrong and untrustworthy. The red pill, not the vessel. Or is it the pill? Can you even decide which one you don't trust? As the American saying goes, when someone tells you who they are, believe them the first time. Maybe that's why theologians are so confused about translations of the word belief. This week, I discuss Luke chapter 6, verses 41 to 42.
You're listening to the Bible as literature.
Each week, the Bible as Literature podcast brings you in-depth discussion of the biblical text in a format short enough for your morning commute, but long enough to be substantive, posing difficult questions meant to keep you engaged. If you value this work, please consider donating as little as 25 cents per episode. That's just $1 per month. To learn more, please visit patreon.com/Bible. That's patreon.com/Bible. Thank you.
Hi, this is Father Mark Boulos, and you are listening to episode 538 of the Bible as Literature podcast. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but you do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, "Brother, let me take out the speck that is in your eye," when you yourself do not see the log that is in your eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye. When I was a kid, I would try to grapple with this verse. The concept, at least in English, of a speck being in your eye made sense because I used to work with my uncles at church, and we'd get stuff in our eye and have to wash our eyes out because when we were kids, we didn't wear goggles and masks when we worked. I mean, we just worked. So we'd get stuff in our eyes when we worked. Now we have to put on all kinds of safety gear, and there are helicopters flying over us. I mean, what can you do? That's the world we live in. So it made sense to me when someone got a speck in their eye, but the log didn't make sense because it was only later that I realized that we're dealing with literature, which means that it's terminology and lexicography. And as I keep saying, and years ago, there were podcast listeners. I'm sure there are many podcast listeners who become frustrated that I keep saying the word functionality. Are we really talking about not a log? I mean, that's the problem with colonial scholars. They like to make the text sound nice. So they come across this word dokos, which is lexicographically linked to the Hebrew term Torah, which has an itinerary of importance in the consonantal Hebrew text. It's a beam. It's something technical. It's linked to the construction of the temple, to the construction of houses made of cedar. And anyone who's heard scripture knows that that's not a good thing. But, you come across this wise saying by the sage Jesus in the New Testament, and you try to make sense of it, you come up with this word log. So there I was as a kid sitting in Sunday school listening to someone try to explain this text who, through no fault of their own. I mean, maybe it was their fault in the sense that we are all responsible for the divine words of God, but no one ever gave them serious instruction in the gospel. So none of us should really judge anyone. He was trying to explain this and gave it their best shot. But it's kind of silly listening to someone try to explain this text in English. A log in your eye? I mean, come on. What the heck does that mean? Yet, the power of this text is that it's hard to miss, even if you don't know what you're talking about, that the basic message is there. Stop judging each other because you're not the judge. Yet, even on that level, all of us reject it because we just can't help ourselves. We want to play God. We just can't help ourselves. As I tried to explain in the opening monologue. It's a monologue. I'm not interested in what you have to say because I'm not the judge. Why should I care what you have to say? Why should I care? All that matters is what the text says, which judges me and judges you. In any case, these terms, once again, kaphos, which means speck, and dokos, which means not log, but aligns to Torah, refers to a beam, to timber work associated in the consonantal Hebrew with the construction of houses. But ultimately, in the itinerary of this term in biblical Hebrew, it's associated with the construction of the temple by Solomon. But let's start with this function, tet, resh, fe, taraf, which appears first in the book of Genesis, in chapter 8, verse 11. It's not a speck. Again, as intuitive as it seems, I know it sounds nice to refer to kaphos, which in Greek means like a dry stalk. It sounds nice to say speck, and it makes sense. And someone, after a long day of hard work, went with his buddies, maybe to have a drink or something after poring over a manuscript to translate this into English. I don't know what century or where, and maybe it came later after centuries of work trying to translate these texts into English. going all the way back to colonial times or much later in an office somewhere in Europe or the United States. I don't know when they eventually landed on the word speck. That would be a great paper for someone to write. Maybe it's in the King James text. I don't know. But it's ridiculous. Dry stalk refers to like something ripped off of a plant. And in fact, what's interesting is that this word kaphos, which aligns to, as I said, the Hebrew function tet resh fe, also is interfunctional in Semitic with the Arabic taraf, which means to tear or to take a portion, because it's talking about taking something off of originally a plant. And in Genesis chapter 8, verse 11, the dove came to him toward evening, and behold, in her beak was a taraf, freshly picked olive leaf. So it's a freshly picked branch. No one, not a branch, but a leaf, but it's something ripped from a plant. So Noah knew that the water had subsided from the earth. So in Genesis, it refers to a freshly picked leaf. And here in Luke, it's something picked, but it's dried up. That's why they translate it as speck. But you see the function. It's something torn off and something small. So there's a progression here in these two verses in the Greek New Testament. And in verse 41 and verse 42, we go from this small piece of dry stalk or this small leaf ripped off, torn off, to something large, this beam, this piece of timber that's used for construction, the construction of houses, the construction of Solomon's temple. So you're going from something small, which in its first appearance, in its itinerary in the Old Testament, in its itinerary in Scripture, was initially a sign of hope. It was a sign of hope at first sight. After, in judgment, God already gave his verdict. I'm sick of all of you. That's the answer to the blind leading the blind. That's why there's no point in coming before the judge and stating your case. That's why the only hope is grace. Please pay close attention to what I'm saying about the judgment, because it's no joke. Anyone who has children, if they're attentive to what I'm saying, and if you're really honest with yourself, will get the message. The notion that there's any hope for humanity beyond grace and mercy is absurd, because the answer to what is earned was already given in Genesis chapter 6, verse 13. And the consequence of the blind leading the blind was already given. This is what Luke is telling you with the use of this terminology. Why are you making a thing out of this dry stalk when God offered you this hope of this fresh leaf, when all of you deserve to be wiped out in the first place? Why are you still complaining? This whole movement is against your complaints. Don't bring your complaints before the judge. Stop accusing each other. That's the message here. Why are you accusing your brother? Because if you come before me in court, I have every reason to condemn all parties. So the best possible course of action is not to accuse, because you don't have a case. This is the point. It's a damning verse, much more damning than the way it's taught in Sunday school. Like, who are you to accuse? Because when you take that, who are you to accuse, you're letting yourself off the hook as though your sin is worse than mine. That's not what Jesus is saying in Luke. He's saying all of you are under condemnation, including the one teaching, because Jesus will be crucified. Hear the message of Deuteronomy. No one gets out from under the curse. It's a very harsh teaching. The New Testament is so harsh. But no one explains it because no one is taking the time to deal with its terminology. How can you say to your brother, let me take out this piece of dry stalk? Why is it dried up, this fresh leaf that was brought to you after God wiped everything out? Why is it dried up? Because no one's hearing scripture. No one is dealing with the text. You're just pontificating in Sunday school because everybody's lazy. You show up, you spend a few minutes dealing with an English text, which is literally a dead text. With respect to scripture, English is a beautiful language. I have a colleague who has been exposing me to English poetry. It's wonderful. But with respect to scripture, English is dead. So that's kafos, taraf. And again, in Arabic, it's this function to tear, to take a portion, a torn off piece or fragment. It's not good news. It's good news in Genesis. It's functional, but it's not good news. And even in Genesis, you see now through its itinerary that it's a sword of Damocles. It's a big joke. It's a big joke. It's so nauseating when a world leader gets up in front of the United Nations and refers to himself as the blessing and his enemies as the curse. Is this what Deuteronomy is saying? This is how Christians talk. This is how Jews talk now on the world stage. Not all Jews and not all Christians, but this is how the cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs people talk. I mean, it's how everyone talks. There are atheists who talk this way. There are political extremists who talk this way. Anyone who pursues their own ego to its final conclusion talks this way. I'm the blessing, the other guy is the curse. No, friends. No, that's not what Scripture is saying. Not at all. The blessing and the curse are in his hand. No one wants to hear that. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. Come on, are you kidding? So as I said, this word dokos, which is more accurately translated beam, is associated via the Septuagint lexically with the Hebrew word korah, which is associated with houses and walls. It appears in its itinerary in the Song of Solomon, for example. Korot, our houses are cedars, our rafters, cypresses. It appears in 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 2, as I said, as part of Solomon's temple. So in its itinerary, ultimately, we go from something positive, which is hope, the possibility, the promise, to something in the end, in Habakkuk, in the story of Solomon, to something negative, to something associated once again with tyranny and God's wrath. And there's some nuance, of course, in its function in Solomon's interaction with the Shulamite outsider. But it's a precious function in Scripture. And Luke is hitting this consistent point that no matter what God does, going all the way back to Genesis, if whatever is sown comes from us, it ends up not working out. Nothing we do produces a good result. And whatever we touch undoes the good that God does for us. Even if he wipes everything out, even if he sends his own anointed son, it doesn't work out in the end. There's something that we do that produces a bad result. It shouldn't be lost on us in a story that is condemning the construction of temples, that an effort is made to show the itinerary of this word, Torah, which pertains not to the construction with stone, but the construction with wood, with the beam, the cedar beams as a mechanism of construction. Because a tree is planted, a sprig is set so that it can grow up and have branches like the cedars of Lebanon. So they can be planted and grow up and have broad branches so that birds can come and rest on its branches. But what do? We cut them down to make these beams so that we can construct houses. It's funny reading commentaries about the story of Elisha where this term appears. They talk about how it's positive that they were growing and expanding and building houses. That's an incorrect hearing of the story. It's not positive. Construction is not positive in Scripture. Growth is not positive in Scripture. Not by the hand of man, not with the things we build. It's not what this text is about. God is interested in planting his seed so that what he has sown will bear fruit. And we are cutting it down so that we can make beams. And this is the terminology that Luke is using to describe the framework that we set up to establish a human court for human judgment, which is the court by which we will ultimately judge the Christ in the story. It's not we who are judging, it's the characters in the story, but ultimately that's what we do as those who listen in on this story, which isn't addressed to us, it was addressed to someone else. But that's how we behave, and that's why we're condemned by it. Yalla. Bye.
You've just heard the Bible as literature. Thanks for listening.
The Bible as Literature is a production of the Ephesus School Network.